Good evening, everyone. Now, okay, so this evening I'm going to talk about screen typography, words made usable. Essentially, this is the design of words on screens to make them readable, to make them legible, and ultimately to make them usable. We tend to think of screens and associate them with images, but actually more and more screens are becoming overloaded with words. And in fact, we're using and consuming and creating more words than ever before than we did on paper. And as a result, the design of text or the design of words on screen is becoming more and more important. So today I'd like to go through 4 aspects. Look at the design and definition of typography and hopefully broaden your understanding of it. Also talk about screens and how words are represented on screens. And talk about our interaction with screens and texts on them as audiences. Then I'm going to demo the Wasteland app, which is an interactive iPad version of a very famous 20th century poem by T.S. Eliot, which you may or may not have seen or be aware of, but it's certainly an interesting reading experience on screen. So, a little bit about typography. Typography is a little bit of an anorak sport in that it's a kind of a hidden creative discipline. When you say to people you're a typographer or you're a type designer, they kind of say, well, what's that? Is it just about fancy fonts or, you know, choosing a typeface? And it is in some ways, but it's also about creating really kind of interesting and engaging reading experiences. Readability is the goal of good typographic design. For a text to be readable, the first thing it has to be is legible. If you can't read a text, then it fails from the outset. So as a typographer and as a type designer, designing reading experiences that are logical, that are ordered, that have a hierarchical structure that the readers can understand, designing them in such a way that there's focal points within the text for emphasis so that the reader can understand and find their way through the text is really a critical function of good typographic design. However, good design is not just about the functional aspects, it's also about creating a visual experience, interpreting words and giving them a visual presentation that engages the reader. The look of the words, what typeface is used, what color are they, what size, what weight, and so on. Again, they may seem like very simple choices, but actually it's the combination of those choices that create the look and the feel of text, its function and its form. And these two things combining is what gives us really nice reading experience. There are many, many examples of typography that we could apply that sort of approach to, but I just thought I'd pick one example to kind of show you that, you know, words are all around us in all different forms, and finding, I suppose, engaging reading experiences, we can find them in the most unlikely places. This is the Vietnam War Memorial Monument in Washington. Anybody have any of you visited it? Yeah? Okay. So I hope that you've had this sense of kind of, it's a very poignant narrative in terms of its typographic design. I just thought I'd point out some of the aspects of it by way of, again, explaining what typographic design is. Firstly, the hierarchy or the order of the information, the names of all the soldiers who died in the war, they're presented in their battalion. So essentially the soldiers' names are amongst friends, those they fought with and those they died with. And that brings a lovely narrative to the organisation of the information. It's not just an A to Z list. The visual, physical materials used, it's a polished stone wall, which again, it's quite austere and it's quite, I suppose, dignified as a monument, but it's got this lovely reflective surface, so you see the world around it reflected in it and the life. The letter forms are carved beautifully on the surface, and they're tactile. So again, you see visitors coming up to the wall and touching the names. And you can see relatives also taking rubbings. So again, there's this lovely kind of interaction, this usability with the wall. So overall, I think as a reading experience and a piece of typographic design, it's a lovely example. So a little bit about screens. Again, I've been studying this area for quite a while, and when I started to research kind of, if you like, the history and the properties of screen, I found it quite hard to find material about it. And really it's because screens have developed at a rate of knots in the last kind of few decades, but really there was a big jump, if you like, before we had a picture frame to the moving image. This little diagram here, it just shows you kind of the types of, I suppose, the milestones in the development of screens. And there's a lot of technology that goes on behind them. I'm not so interested in the technology, and I won't get into that tonight, but just to say that there is lots going on behind the scenes about how letter forms and words are rendered on screens to make them readable, to make them feel comfortable for us to read. If you think back to early screens, you know, they were very sore on your eyes to try and read text. But now we've arrived at a point with iPads and iPhones where we're happy to read text off screen. Has anybody read a book on their iPhone or their smartphone? Has anybody been brave enough to do that yet? I read my first book on a trip on an iPhone, and I was amazed that I could actually sustain a reading experience on it. So the quality and the resolution of screens are getting better, and they're getting smaller and smaller. On the letter form front, there's been a lot of typefaces designed for screen, specifically for screen. And again, you'll be familiar with many of them because they're on your devices. But just again, the level of care and thought that goes into the design of these letter forms. This typeface is the one that I used in the design of the Wasteland app, which I'll go into in a bit more detail later, but I just wanted to point out some of the actual visual, physical properties of letter forms as they've been designed for screen. So you can see here the stroke of the letter, it's the same thickness all the way around. So essentially it's a low contrast typeface, and it means that when the letter forms are reduced, they're still very readable. You'll also notice that the counter shapes, the O's and the E's, you'll see that they're quite big. So that, again, they don't fill in when they're reduced quite small. And on the serif typeface, which is the one on the right here, the little legs at the bottom, they're straight and they're quite thick. So again, they're designed to be legible on screen. So what about us on screens? I suppose our earliest experience as as audiences of screens was sitting together in a cinema, in a dark space, passively watching moving pictures on the screen. Then, if you like, the next big jump, the screen got smaller and it appeared in our living rooms, and we could share the experience between family and friends. Then we moved to a one-on-one relationship with screens, us and primarily the PC. And if you like, our experience, our interaction with the screen changed from one of entertainment or maybe perhaps passive viewing to maybe an interactive one and more perhaps a productive one where we're actually doing something. Then came the advent of the internet, and suddenly there was lots of people on screens talking to each other. Then we got legs because we could walk around with our screens. So again, with mobile screens, suddenly we could walk around with our screens anywhere we wanted to go, and we could talk to anyone we wanted. So really, if you think about how we interact with screens, we've gone from being in a fixed location and not doing very much to basically doing anything we like, anywhere we want to, and at any time. Mirroring the kind of development of the actual screen devices is also the type of content that we've been experiencing. So again, if we think about screen content, and if we think about text, the early screens where we've been watching them was narrative content. It was story-based. And again, earliest typography on screen would have been title cards in films or film titles. Then we moved into more information-based type information, and again with the web, looking at web pages, a lot of information-based content, and gradually then into more immersive content or interactive content with the influence of perhaps games and interactive devices. From a design perspective, the challenge is now greater. So you've got content, as I've mentioned, narrative content that is motion-based, that has sound. So suddenly I can design typography that has sound attached to it, that can move. So the challenge for me as a designer is changing. Again, traditionally we're used to designing page-based information for print, but there's again a whole lot of things you need to understand about designing typography in this area. And then interface design. So as typography is becoming interactive, we're now moving into the area of perhaps engagement, looking at maybe game design techniques, and also human-computer interaction techniques of usability and accessibility. So from both an audience and a design perspective, it's a whole different ballgame in terms of designing texts on screens as opposed to in print. And where are we now? Well, pretty much every day we consume and create more text, I think, than ever before. And our relationship with text is changing. We're becoming authors, we're becoming consumers, and we're reading in a different way. Texts are getting shorter, and if they don't grab our attention quick enough, we don't read them. Text is also content, and it's also user interface. So there's a real mix between its function, its form, and its content. And from a design perspective, that's very challenging. And as I said, screens, we associate them with images, and we hear people say, oh, my children don't read anymore, they just want to stay on screens, but actually they're reading probably a lot more, and they're probably sending a lot more text messages. So, from a design perspective, how do you design a text on the screen? How do you make it engaging? How do you make it readable? How do you make it usable? When suddenly you have all these options at your fingertips, literally, or at your mouse click. You can read, you can watch text, you can move it, you can click on it, you can touch it, and you can even hear it speak. So I think text and screens are moving typography and our consumption of text into a whole different realm. So I'm just going to demonstrate the Wasteland app. It's the famous poem by T.S. Eliot, first published in 1922, and it's jointly developed by Faber and Faber and Touch Press in the UK. This made App of the Week in the US iTunes store. It was launched on a Monday, and it was App of the Week by the end of the week. Very unlikely event, given that it's a very difficult poem. It's a modernist layered kind of multi-voiced poem loaded with biblical and mythical and classical literary references. So it's a very difficult literary text, quite quite dry. So why did it become App of the Week? Well, it's certainly not down to just the typographic design, although I do believe that it made a significant contribution. But it's also about how the whole reading experience is crafted through the design of the interface and the content. So let me just show you. So firstly, one of the things we had to tackle was designing for a moving orientation. And again, typeface, it's a nice serif typeface, very readable on screen. The page, we used page conventions. The intent of the design was to make a very kind of spare, elegant presentation that put the text of the poem at the center of the reading experience, but yet the interface would have a lot of very rich functionality that would enhance the reading experience and yet not obscure it. We used conventions, so for example, this is a running header, but it also acts as a navigation device. And again, aspects of motion, you can just scroll up and down and you'll notice there's a gentle bounce, so it makes the text very fluid. The colour of the text, again, it's a muted grey on a grey background, so again, it's very comfortable to read.
The river's tent is broken. The last fingers of leaf clutch and sink into the wet bank. The wind crosses the brown land unheard. The nymphs
crosses the brown land unheard. The nymphs are departed. Sweet
And again, voices read the poem. So again, there's audio readings of the poem at a touch. And you can switch voices as the poem is read. But again, the typography highlights in sync with the audio, and it makes for a very kind of natural reading experience. You can't see this, but if I swipe gently across the text, it invokes the original manuscript, which again shows the original typescript that Eliot had and all of the annotations on. It was reduced right down. We designed a navigation device here. Again, one of the problems on screen is trying to see the size of the text, the entirety of the text. So this little device here, you can scroll through the text and see it. Okay, so I'm running out of time here, so I'm very quickly going to show you. This is the poem, a performance, so a video performance of the poem by Fiona Shaw, filmed in Dublin.
The burial of the dead. April is the cruelest month. Breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire.
And if I turn her, she goes to full screen.
With spring rain.
And I can
went on in memory.
I can tap any line in the poem and she will read it. Okay. And then just very, very lastly, I'm just going to show you again. Do you remember writing your notes furiously during English class when you were trying to understand a poem that your teacher was teaching you? Well, again, there's academic notes included, and you can touch any line on the poem and invoke the full study guide with the annotated notes attached to it. So it's a new way of reading. It's a new way of experiencing text on screen, and I hope that it's just a start, certainly from my perspective, in terms of designing interactive text on screens that I think will make them very usable and engaging. Thank you.